This is Synchronicity.
This is Synchronicity.
This is Synchronicity.
This is Synchronicity.
This is Synchronicity. This is Synchronicity.
Welcome to Synchronicity. This is episode 21. My guest today is Danny Goldberg. This is his second time on the show. He was on actually episode 17, so not that long ago. The episode clipped off at the end because the batteries in my recorder died, even though I prefaced that in that episode that I didn't think they would die, but they did. So I have Danny back on, and we picked up where we left off in our last conversation, which was politics. I personally have had a love-hate relationship with politics for most of my adult life. I actually protested at the Supreme Court in 2000 when George W. Bush beat Al Gore with the Hanging Chads incident in Florida. And I was really into politics, but shortly thereafter, I got actually pretty disillusioned when I headed off to college, thought the whole system was rigged, which it may or may not be. But I kind of didn't really pay attention to politics too much. But I got to say, this election cycle has really kind of piqued my interest again. How could it not, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. And yes, it's kind of like a sporting event in this country, which is probably not the best way to approach politics in general, but at least people are paying attention. I don't know. Maybe that's not a great thing. Maybe all this rancor and, you know, the huge dichotomy and polarization of politics isn't very productive, but you know, at least people are paying attention. So the podcast pretty much centers around politics totally. So if you're not a political person, you probably won't love this one, but I still encourage you to listen to it because I think it's interesting. And at the end there, I do ask Danny, you know, how he maintains or some practical tips on his spiritual path and how this relates to politics and kind of the approach that some of us could be taking, you know, when engaging with the world. One of the things that this reminds me of is Ram Dass. He has a great saying. He has an article on ramdas.org that basically he says, have you ever noticed how many angry people there are at peace rallies? You know, people screaming, peace, 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 you know, yelling at people and the government because, you know, they want peace. And the irony that's involved in that, and, you know, that's not just he's not just highlighting a problem there for the sake of highlighting a problem. He says, listen, the best thing you can do is work on yourself and make sure that you're as clear as you can be before engaging with the world or a society or culture, because that ultimately will make your message more effective. People will hear you in a different way, and you'll also be open and receptive to other opinions and perspectives. Like, one of the dangers with politics is getting locked in and stubborn, and this happens on both sides, right wing, left wing. Everybody, you know, is always at the mercy of their own particular perspective. So it's really important to try to cultivate as many different perspectives as possible. You've heard me say this on the show before, or if you haven't heard this show before, you're hearing me say it now. So that's like it's very important, I think, to really be open-minded, especially when engaging with something as polarizing as politics. Here's the thing. So we had a book giveaway this past week. FYI, let me back it up. This is a bonus episode. I wanted to get this out from Danny sooner rather than later. So there's actually going to be another episode this week in a couple of days. Today is Tuesday, the 22nd. I'm also going to be releasing one tomorrow. So that one is going to be with Ben Kovacs. He works at Twitter. He founded something called Guardian Gym. He also has a marijuana accessories company called Meister. Very interesting episode. And that's going to be coming out tomorrow. So you're getting a twofer this week. But what I am going to announce, since it's already been decided, is the winner of this week's book giveaway. The book, in case you don't know what I'm talking about, every week I'm giving away a brand new book, something that I've read, something that I think other people would enjoy. That's going to happen every single week. I'm not going to start the contest in this episode. It'll start in the next one. So if you want to find out what the book giveaway is, you'll have to listen to the next episode with Ben. But I am going to announce the winner of this current book giveaway right now. So congratulations to Derek. I am finding out where you live, and I am going to be sending the book out to you today. The book was The Supernatural by Whitley Strieber and Jeff Kripal. Again, I still don't know how to say his name, and it's excellent. I've spoken about it before. The episode with Jeremy Johnson, episode 20 of Synchronicity, we talk about it quite a bit. And Derek, I hope you love the book. I really did. I breezed through it in a week. So yeah, if you want a chance to win or get, be a recipient of a book giveaway, all you have to do is go to Sync Podcast. That's SYNC podcast.com. Once again, I'm going to assume you know how to spell podcast. And then on the right side, there's a sidebar there, and it says join the Synchronicity community, and it'll be very clear about what you're joining. And just put in your email, and then you're automatically entered. And then I do a random drawing every week, and if just by virtue of being a part of the community, you have an opportunity to win a book. So I thought that was pretty cool. I'd be into that. So I hope you guys are too. So back to Danny. This episode, Danny is a really interesting guy, and I've spoken to him before about this in the previous episode, but he's someone who has really reached the upper echelons of his particular profession in the music business, but really still maintains a very practical kind of spiritual context for his life, which I am consistently impressed by people who can do that, because it's easy to have a spiritual practice where you're all woo-woo and you're totally off in space and, you're not really engaging with reality, consensus reality. That's kind of easy to do. I don't think it's a great thing to do, but it's easy to do. And I think there's a lore of kind of the New Age movement that we have been experiencing for the past 20, 30 years, really since the 60s, that kind of lends itself to that, everything is love and light. There's nothing else besides that. And well, that might be true. There are these other things that we have to deal with, like shadow aspects of ourselves and the culture and society, which are very manifest in politics. So I really love speaking to Danny whenever I get a chance, because I like to hear how someone who has kind of walked in the world in a very significant way still maintains kind of a spiritual perspective. So it's always fun talking to him. You know what? I'm not going to babble anymore. Do I have anything else to say? Rate and review on iTunes, right? Rate and review on Stitcher. That's it. I don't got anything else to say outside of that. So I'm going to start this episode. Don't forget, there's another episode tomorrow. And I got some really cool guests coming after that, which I think you guys are going to love. As always, if you want to get in touch, shoot me an email at noah@syncpodcast.com. And yes, I am still a part of mindpodnetwork.com. You will still find my episodes over there. I just have a new website for myself because I thought it would be fun. So yeah, without further ado, here is Danny Goldberg, part 2. Okay, so thank you again for coming on. I know we cut off, my bad, on the recording of the last one.
Your battery.
Yeah.
This is a battery-driven part 2. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be back.
Cool. Thanks, man. So I wanted to pick up where we left off, which was politics, and specifically we were talking about. Scalia had just died, and we were talking about some of the rancor that was coming out of that, and you left it with a very poignant statement that was basically like Ruth Bader Ginsburg knew him personally, and she was able to kind of transcend the political stuff that was going on. Said like she was a good friend of his, and that it was a sad thing on humanity. And I thought,
and they disagreed on almost everything.
Right, everything. Right.
And in her dissents, she was, very. Clear and vivid in her dissents, on things like Citizens United or Bush v. Gore. And a funny thing happened since then. Nancy Reagan just died.
Yeah.
And there's a piece on Huffington that Norman Lear wrote, a very short piece that really deeply touched me. I know that he had this personal, I know him over the years. I wouldn't say we're close, but I've been lucky enough to get to know him over several decades, a certain amount. And one time he had told me how Ronald Reagan always answered his letters, and that he had this long correspondence with Ronald Reagan. And they agreed on literally nothing politically. And certainly Norman, I think, is again, pretty vivid in his politics and what he stands for. And it's very, very different from anything Reagan stood for politically. But that he managed this personal relationship with him. And I get, apparently from the piece he wrote with Nancy, and he's 93 now. She was 94. So these are our elders in the literal sense of the word. And he was saying how he wept twice, once losing a friend, and secondly, because so many of his other friends said, how can you be friends with somebody like that? And that he missed a world where people could have those disagreements and still respect each other as human beings. So I think that's an important part of the conversation. And at the same time, I just think Ronald Reagan did tremendous damage to the country. I mean, I'm not somebody who ever admired him politically, and I still don't, but I do recognize that, everybody's part of God, including Ronald Reagan, and there's got to be a way of recognizing that. I think Ram Dass on his altar, Ram Dass pretty, as far as I know, politically liberal about everything, and has been, as long as he's been a public figure, used to have on his puja table usually a Republican as well as a Democrat, just to try to. Didn't he say once that when his guru said love everybody, that one of the hardest things was for him to love Republicans?
Yeah, it was George Bush specifically.
Yeah. So, it's one of those things, but it's hard to imagine how anything could get better with more anger. But boy, there's so much going on that's really very, very upsetting at the same time.
Wow. Speaking of, I'm getting feedback. There it goes. This is going to be a little awkward, but I'm going to wait 2 seconds when you're done talking because it's picking up the echo, thinking you're still talking through your speakers. Do you have headphones?
I do have some headphones.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I think that'll solve it. You hear me?
Yes.
All right, perfect.
Is this better?
Yeah, there's going to be no feedback. My voice comes out of the computer and goes in through your speakers.
Okay, got it.
Cool. Well, I'm going to pick it up. You said there's so many troubling things going on in the world. Let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump and kind of what's going on with the Republican side. I mean, what's your take? What the fuck is going on?
I guess the real interesting thing to me is not Donald Trump so much as the people who love Donald Trump, and what is it about him that they love, and how did it come to pass that they would be responding to things that he's saying? Because I think Donald Trump is mostly interested in winning. Right. So, I mean, he must believe some of what he's saying, but I suspect a lot of it is based on a pretty shrewd analysis of that part of the public that's so who between talk radio and disparity of wealth and diminishing economic opportunities for a majority of the country, and the foreclosures and other things, that the level of anger has just increased, and the appeal of racism has increased to some of those folks. I don't really know what to say about it. That's not been said. There's probably more blogs and articles and commentary about it than anything else in the political world these next few months. It's hard to think of something original to say, except I don't think there's any way of processing what's happening without factoring racism into it. And then you've got to go deeper into, well, why are people racist? And it has to do with, historically, people feeling being manipulated into thinking that people of different races are their problem. Martin Luther King talked a lot about that, where he was he was in jail once, and he got to talking to the white prison guards,
right.
and how they were going on about how at that time the big issue was racial integration in the South, and he was in a Southern jail, and how it was so wrong, and how everything he was saying was wrong. He says, and then I started asking these brothers how much money they were earning. And when I found out what they were earning, I said to them, you ought to be out there marching with us.
Yeah.
And that they had been, manipulated into substituting, some racial pride for rationality about economics. There's something to that. I don't know what to say. I hope and pray that Donald Trump doesn't become president. I don't feel that would be good for
anyone,
humanity, or this country. But I think that anybody else in public life, including the people that I support, need to dig much deeper to really understand the consequences of the status quo, and how many people are feeling left out and scared, and that there has to be a more significant level of changes than what we've seen the last 5 or 6 years. Even though I'm glad Obama, I voted for Obama twice, and I'm glad I did, given who he ran against. There's a level of intense need that I think is greater than the typical incremental, so-called pragmatic Washingtonian thinks. And then when you see this kind of anger, it turns out that they're not all that pragmatic, because they've obviously lost touch with, the majority of the country between the insurgencies and the two parties. But that said, I still have a preference, and my preference is, personally, my belief is that none of the Republicans would contribute to a healing as much as any of the Democrats would. But I understand people who are frustrated with the Democrats. I mean, I've also been frustrated with them. And then I understand, and then the Hillary people say, yeah, but it's easy to stamp your foot and wish that the world were different, but the real world involves a lot of different sources of power, that presidents are not kings, and just because you elect somebody to the U.S. Senate or the presidency doesn't give them automatic ability to fix things. They're still in a world where banks and military and other countries and local and state governments have power. And so there's a sense of simplifying these presidential elections as if that's the binary choice. It's going to make things better or not better. And even though it really matters who's president, I've always voted for president, and as long as I'm conscious and able to, I always will. It's just so naive and childish to think that is the sole factor in determining what happens with government.
What do you think about someone like Bernie Sanders, who is I voted for Obama the first time around. I didn't vote the second time. I didn't vote for anyone. I looking back, I've come full circle. Wasn't a huge Obama fan. Like 4 years in, 3 years in, I was like, he promised all this dramatic change, and look what's happened, really not that much. And then I look back at his presidency, and I see that he's really implemented some pretty amazing things, and some amazing things have happened under his watch. Some not amazing things too. There's good and bad, but I have kind of accepted that at least there was some change. I heard it described as kind of like turning an aircraft carrier, right? You turn the wheel. It doesn't move right away. It's a really slow process. It's an incremental positive change. And that's kind of, I think it might have been Obama who was using that when he was speaking to Mark Maron on a podcast. And it was essentially, I found it pretty interesting because we like everything to be binary. So the reason I asked about Bernie is I'm a Bernie supporter at this point. I don't know that he's the panacea, he's going to change the world, but I feel like he believes in what he's saying, and he's been saying a similar thing for a very long period of time. But I also hear from a lot of people that it's not realistic. It's kind of the same pipe dream that we're going to be fed, that, oh yeah, it's all Wall Street's problem. It's a very simplistic fix. But I honestly don't know at this point, right? I don't know that being more pragmatic and more moderate is the way to get things done. Or to me, truthfully, what I think he's tapping into, Bernie, is that this shit is really fucked up. People can objectively see that all of these things he's saying are true. Corporations dominate everything. Banks and Wall Street dominate everything. The corporate culture is really destroying
whatever you view as the middle class, but anyone who's not making a decent amount of money, it's hard. Like, I have people my age, who I graduated college with, who are really, really struggling, and they're talented, they're skilled, they want to work, and there's nothing wrong with them except the jobs that they thought would be there are not. And that's not all, just to be clear, in my opinion. It's not all because of institutional things that are fucked up. We're in a crazy transition period, right? The automation alone is eliminating jobs, and there's so many other factors here. So what's your take on someone like Bernie, who seems to be tapping into kind of knowing that we need some real big change, and then kind of harping that? I love Bernie, I like him in the debates, but I do find that he says pretty much the same thing all of the time, even if I agree with that thing very much. So what's your take on someone like him?
Well, there's a lot of things that you said. Firstly, I'm planning on voting for Bernie, and I've contributed to Bernie's campaign. And two of the artists that I work with, not that my artists and I always agree, but it so happens two of my clients, Steve Earle and Jill Sobule, are both public Bernie supporters and have done some things for him. Candidly, and some of the Bernie people will be upset with me for saying this, but, I feel, it's the podcast, the one virtue of this medium is we get to be honest and not be overly diplomatic. I think it's extremely unlikely that he's going to actually get the nomination.
That's who
And I think that the reason for that has a lot to do with things that he just can't control. But his whole career has been in Vermont, which is overwhelmingly white, and the electorate of the Democratic Party is much more racially diverse. And there's just something about the way he communicates and comes across that doesn't seem to be moving enough people of color to create any trajectory that makes it seem likely that he's going to get the nomination. Right. So we're speaking at that moment. Now we'll know more tomorrow. There's a Michigan primary tonight, which is actually pretty interesting.
Yes, very interesting.
Bellwether of that exact thing. So I am sort of in the category of people who, first of all, in terms of the values politically that he articulates, the way to allocate money in the society, how he feels about foreign interventions, his feeling for making certain types of colleges free, his belief in Medicare for all. I completely agree with all of those positions. Right. And it's thrilling to have somebody in the national conversation saying those things. Yeah. It's the last time anyone was saying those kinds of things at a national level was when Jesse Jackson was running for president, and Bernie seems to be having a higher percentage of the overall votes than I remember Jesse Jackson ever having. So I think it's an incredible. So first of all, I'm for him because he speaks for my belief system, and secondly, I think it's incredibly important that whether he wins or he doesn't win, that the size of his vote is a constant fact that people like Hillary Clinton and like Democrats in Congress have to take into consideration, because they're always under so much pressure from business interests, and the conventional wisdom of the media and so on. So, I think he's making at a minimum an extraordinary and unique contribution to the political climate in the country. And that's going to reverberate for many, many years to come. And for the rest of our lives, there are going to be people who came of age during the Bernie Sanders campaign and who were inspired by it and go on to do important work, like what happened with the McGovern campaign. There were people, including Bill Clinton, came out of the McGovern campaign, and Gary Hart and all sorts of other people.
Hillary came out of the Goldwater.
I don't really think the Goldwater
it doesn't matter.
Fair criticism, because she was like a teenager, and if you're going to judge people by what they did as teenagers, then I'm a speed freak.
Well, I know, I hear you. I just remember my friends who are early Republicans in in high school. I don't know what they're doing now, but I hear you.
But I think that if it was really close and our votes really determined who was going to get the nomination, I do think there's a different conversation that's worth having. If it's just about who do I agree with more, it's easy. I agree with Bernie more. 100. If we really were going to determine who's going to get the nomination, I think there's an argument for Hillary. I'm not saying that I subscribe to this argument, but I think it's an argument that one has to think about, which is that it's obviously an unbelievably complicated, difficult job to be president of the United States. I mean, we were talking before we started this podcast about our tiny organization and the complexities in even getting that correct. So to be president of the United States and to deal with these hundreds of thousands of employees, government agencies, laws, the Supreme Court, states and cities, all the other countries in the world, and these non-governmental powers like the banks, Wall Street, and the military, to just name the ones that come off the top of the mind. It's an incredibly hard thing to do. And one thing that one can notice with the first couple of years of Obama's presidency and of Bill Clinton's presidency and of Jimmy Carter's presidencies, the three Democrats that have had power since the 60s, was that it took them a couple of years to figure out how it functioned. And they all made some mistakes in the first couple of years that they wouldn't have made in the last couple of years. And some of them were costly mistakes. I especially think in terms of the first couple of years of Barack Obama's presidency, in my opinion. And I think that's one problem Hillary Clinton won't have. She does know how it works because of having been married to Bill Clinton and been in the White House for 8 years and clearly had a substantial amount of engagement and influence in that administration. And she would be the only person in recent history that would enter the White House on our side of the fence with that level of expertise. Now, if she has that expertise, but she's too beholden to interests that we don't like, that's obviously not a trade-off worth having. But I do think there's some value in having that knowledge and experience that has to be part of the equation in deciding who actually should be the president. Then there's the other argument about who's more likely to beat a Republican. And to me, that's almost like a jump ball. You know, the Hillary argument is that she's been attacked for 25 years, so there's nothing the Republicans do that's going to hurt her anymore, and she knows how to deal with all of their horrible attacks, and that Bernie's never been through having $1 billion spent to damage him, so that she's a safer bet. And the Bernie argument is that she has negatives, because precisely, one might say, because of those 25 years worth of attacks, that he doesn't have, and then in the current polling, he fares better in the matchups against any of the Republicans. But the current polling doesn't necessarily reflect what would be happening in November after that $1 billion is spent. So to me, that's sort of a jump ball. You can make either argument. I think on policy, there's no question that Bernie is more progressive ideologically, but in terms of the experience, I don't think there's any question that she has more relevant experience.
There's no doubt.
And I don't think that that's zero importance. Because you can have the best intentions of the world, but if you don't know how the thing works, it's a real problem. So I think on that level, it's a much closer call than a lot of my Bernie friends want to admit. But I am incredibly inspired and impressed by what Bernie has brought to the process. If he wins Michigan, it's a completely different dynamic and a different conversation. And if it really becomes close, I think all of us, including me, might rethink all this. But I don't think, honestly, that's going to happen, because I do think that there's a certain trajectory of the way different groups in the society are voting. And I don't really see, although there are some young and brilliant African Americans of great influence, like Michelle Alexander, who wrote this incredible book about incarceration and the drug war called The New Jim Crow, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Ben Jealous, former head of the NAACP, and Cornel West. There certainly are some, and Killer Mike. I don't really know if he's actually a successful rapper or just a rapper, but there are definitely some African Americans of real consequence that are for Bernie. But they're in the minority. And there's just that I don't really see that changing, because I do think he's disadvantaged by just not having had to deal with people of color very much in his career. And that doesn't make him a bad person.
No, of course not.
It's just part of reality. I remember when Howard Dean was running for president. I was, in those days, more important in the music business, and presidential candidates would sometimes come and see me. And so David Silver I called David and said, David, come over. Howard Dean's coming over. Let's meet together.
Awesome.
And so he came by the office, and he was against the war in Iraq. And I was so against the war in Iraq. I still am against the war in Iraq, and I have a lot of admiration for people who were against it. And he was running against John Kerry and John Edwards, who had both voted for the war in Iraq. And so, man, I want to support this guy who's the anti-war guy. And but on the other hand, so he comes in to the office, and I said, listen, I really admire you on your position on the war in Iraq, and it's a big deal to me. I said, in terms of really doing things publicly, like fundraisers or anything, I have to admit to you, I'm a little bit conflicted because I'm a New Yorker, and Al Sharpton is also running. And he looked at me and he said something along the lines, well, as if Al Sharpton was just like so not important and not considering. And David and I talked about it afterwards. It was because he's from Vermont.
Right.
He didn't have any idea that Al Sharpton actually
meant something to people.
Did mean a lot, and he meant a lot in terms of that he was inheriting some of the responsibility in the national conversation that Jesse Jackson had done. But he was from New York. I mean, I ended up, I think, contributing to both of the campaigns. But what I got out of it was even this guy, who's obviously a brilliant guy. I mean, I really admire Howard Dean, and I think he's done a lot of other smart things besides being against the war in Iraq. And I really thought he was a very good chairman of the Democratic Party and so forth. But he had obviously just been dealing with white people his whole career because he was from Vermont, where which is 95%.
Yeah, I was going to say like 98%
white. So that's a disadvantage that Bernie has that I don't think he's likely to fix in the next 6 weeks. But we'll see. We'll find out. But I admire both of them. I'm voting for Bernie. I'm so grateful that he's running. I think that the Clinton people who get upset with Bernie should just thank God that Elizabeth Warren didn't run, because I think, if anything, she would have done even better. But the fact is, Hillary Clinton does have experience that's unique, and we're never going to get anyone who's going to be just like me or just like you politically. Anybody, I think Tim Leary said that anybody who wants to be president should be disqualified from running for the office.
I could not agree. I mean, you have to be like kind of insane, right?
That you have to be kind of insane. So they're all insane. And we're dealing among insane people, and that's just the world we live in. Anyway, I'm just babbling. Hopefully some of this hasn't put people listening to sleep.
No. It's incredibly... I mean, what came up, actually, what struck me in what you were speaking about, so many great points in there, and I hadn't thought of actually a very persuasive argument for Hillary in terms of the experience. That I didn't think about that at all, truthfully. I kind of go off my gut when I watch people talk and try to get an intuition of what they believe, and that is not always the best way of determining things. It can be a component of it. But what particularly struck me, though, about what you said is the issue of race came up a bunch. And I know one of your favorite people is Martin Luther King. And so... to me, I'm also very interested when you mentioned the Vermont thing, Howard Dean, Bernie Sanders. I've been lucky enough in my relationships growing up that I've known a lot of black people, a lot of Latino people, a lot of Asian people. I've had a multicultural friend group and social group. So I hear people from the South Bronx perspective on the politics. They don't give a fuck about politics there. They can't worry about it, most people there. That's not even something that's on their thing. So when they look at it, they may be just voting for some other reason that we can't comprehend. So to me, what I'm interested in is how do we kind of get people together? Like you mentioned a lot of the black people there, like Killer Mike and some other people who are really kind of taking up the stand and saying, well, this actually, Bernie is at least speaking to what matters to us, whether we recognize it or not. So like, how do we... I would like to see something more representative. Like we just had a black president. We're having a black president, right? Maybe we'll have a woman president next. But just a black president or potentially a woman president doesn't actually mean that we've changed in any way, right? I mean, I see it's slowly, but I mean, it's a very important point you're making. Like the minority vote, and we call it minority vote, which I think is funny, but the vote isn't going to be there for Bernie, right? We've seen it not be there. Michigan, like you said tonight, could be a bellwether, and it could be a totally different thing. But I think you're right, and I think that's
the last polls. I mean, look, we're gonna by the time this podcast is up, the listeners are going to know the result of it as we speak. She's been 5 points or so ahead in the polls, which is close enough for him to overcome. But most of the time, the polls seem to be pretty accurate so far. on the primaries, the caucuses, there's harder for them to measure. I don't know. It's just the real lesson to me is, there's a gladiator type thing about these elections, the debates and the TV coverage of the primaries and the pundits and the rallies. And there's a sense that it's kind of like a sports event or the Super Bowl where there's the playoffs, and then there's the championship, and then there's a win, and then there's a champion, and end. But the reality is that it's not a sports event.
Right.
It's not a winner or a loser.
It's our country.
It's thousands of individual subtle things that either get better or don't get better. And the details matter, but it's just not all going to happen in one silver bullet magic moment that's going to make us all get along together. It's thousands of small things that we do, and this is where politics sort of meets spirituality.
I love it.
Where it's really what tone of voice you use when you disagree with somebody matters, understanding that sometimes taking a smaller part of what you want is better. I know Ted Kennedy, who is one of my great heroes, regretted for the rest of his life that he blocked a health care plan that Richard Nixon put forward because it wasn't good enough. And in retrospect, he realized that had he supported it, millions of people would have had a better life, even though millions more wouldn't have, And, those are tough calls to make. When do you compromise and when don't you? And I think people of high morals, intelligence, and goodwill could come to different conclusions on some of those issues. And then there are other situations where people are just flat out corrupted by intimidation or money. But I don't think every disagreement is the result of corruption. So, I think everything matters. I think public interest work matters. I think volunteer work matters. I think how you treat people matters. I think how you run your business matters. There are all sorts of voluntary things employers can do that they don't have to do by law that matter. I think local elections matter a lot, and it's just part of what's wrong with the way the media covers politics is this excessive focus on the presidency and a much, much, much less focus on all of these other offices and even congressional races, when the reality is that in the American system, power is fragmented and all these things matter, and who the state assemblyman matters. And the truth of the matter is, I don't know who my state assemblyman is. I'm not proud of it. I actually don't know. And I'm supposedly a person who reads the blogs and books and is engaged and is considered an activist. And right now, as I sit here, I can't remember the name of my state assemblyman. So, I think there's the reality is it's sort of a holistic. You got to make choices in presidential elections. I'm all for people voting. I'm not for people not voting. And I'm for people voting for somebody who has a chance of winning. I'm not a big fan of quixotic third parties that have no chance of winning because I think they have unintended consequences. But I think that really elections are not, once affirming that and affirming be a good citizen, be involved if you can afford to make a contribution. But it's crazy to think that that's the main thing. The main thing is every second of your life and how you deal with every little thing that comes up.
Yes.
And the millions and millions of those things either push a society collectively in one direction or the other.
That's right. So I was thinking my question was going to be is how do you kind of inject spirituality into politics? Is it something that would even be done? And I think what you're saying is actually the essence of it is the way to kind of, and Ram Dass is so great at this too. He talks about if you go to a peace rally, you ever notice how angry everyone is? They're all screaming. I love it. That's one of my favorite things ever. And it's true. It's because whatever you bring to the situation, you're playing out your own stuff just as much as whatever you're doing on the big stage. So I think that's incredibly poignant, and I'm glad that you brought that up because it does. I know we've been talking politics, right? And that maybe seems pretty unrelated to spiritual practice, but to me, they're one and the same. There's nothing that's not.
I mean, it seems like at this moment in time in the American story of people of our culture and generation, not that you and I are the same generation, but we have a lot of connections culturally. That it seems to me like a big priority is to try to have respect for people you disagree with. And that doesn't only mean people on the right, it also means people on the left. There's no disagreements more vicious than among different people.
It's crazy.
I remember during the Occupy period, and I was a fan of a lot of Occupy Wall Street went down there. I mean, the rage was always for these left-wing establishment people who want to co-opt the movement, and then the left-wing people would say, oh, these people, they have no respect for real life and pragmatic, I think the biggest single thing, besides voting and making moral choices, is to try to be, and I'm speaking to myself because I get very self-righteous about whatever my at the moment is, and I just really tend to think people who disagree are not as smart or not as good, and that's just not okay. It doesn't get any good result. That to somehow find a place of recognizing people's humanity that one disagrees with and some shared space, even while maintaining to your ideals and positions, I think that does create a better end result. And not that I'm into compromising on a lot of things the way, I'm not one of those people that believe the middle of the road is always the place to be. I'm a left-winger on almost every issue.
Sure.
But I do think that we have to stop dehumanizing people we disagree with. And that's something that we on the left do just as much as people on the right do, in my observation.
Everyone. I mean, I think I see it from there's no position that kind of protects against that. So what are some practical tips that you use in your life to kind of cultivate, like you said you're aware that this is, there's a way to open-mindedly disagree with someone. So how do you kind of cultivate that in yourself?
I'm struggling with it. As recently as the last month or two, I've been at dinners where I get into these sort of arguments with people, and then afterwards I just feel terrible. So I say to myself, if my goal is to make the world better, then how can an argument that makes me feel terrible and creates a bad vibe be a good thing? I mean, the main thing to me is to just try to, the whole thing, think before I speak, take a deep breath, try to tune in at a deeper level before expressing an opinion, make sure that, is the opinion really, do I have to really express every single opinion I have to everybody all the time? I mean,
I ask myself,
or is there, my teacher Hilda used to try to say things that are true, kind, and helpful. And she would say, there are a lot of things that are true, kids. She called all of her students kids. There are a lot of things that are true, kids, that aren't necessarily kind or helpful. That's something
right
to aspire to anyway.
That's great right there, though. I mean, that's a good kind of barometer for whether you should be saying something or not. And I mean, I see it all the time, just, on the web, social media, Facebook.
At least 2 out of 3.
That's what I was thinking when you were saying it.
At least get 2 out of 3.
That's
right?
what I was thinking when you were saying it. It's like 2 out of 3 seems like it would probably be good enough for this day and age at this point. In the Kali Yuga, we can take 2 out of the 3 out of those. I love that. All right, listen, I'm gonna clip it here because I like that this was kind of centered around politics. I am very much into it. I've recently had a resurgence of really getting into it. I'm going to an event for Bernie Sanders fundraiser. That's a club music thing that I'm seeing fields merge that I never thought would. I'm excited about it. I also, like you, I don't think Bernie is going to be the nominee. I don't. But
I'll tell you, I am so inspired I think he's handled himself brilliantly. I think he's expanded the progressive world in a way that really no one has done in recent memory. Yeah. And if he surprises us, we'll have to do another podcast to talk about it. But even what he's already accomplished is very significant. But there's a very good chance that we're going to be in a different conversation in a month or so. And if that's the case, I'm definitely going to be for Hillary over any of the Republicans.
We can talk about it then, too. Thanks, Danny. I love these conversations. They're really
it's so nice for you to include me in your podcast. To be continued.
Cool. Thanks, Danny.
Bye.
Well, if you like politics, I hope you like that episode. If you like politics and you didn't like that episode, well, then just tell me why. Write in and say, oh, I didn't like that. No, that was no good. But I think you should have if you're staying to this point of the show. As a reminder, there will be a podcast coming out tomorrow, which is March 23rd. That one's going to be with Ben Kovacs. I'll also be announcing this week's book giveaway. It's a very cool book. I just finished it. It's awesome. You're not going to know what it is until I tell you tomorrow. But yeah, stay tuned. And thank you, as always, for listening. I really, really, really appreciate it. All right. Bye-bye.